According to Aristotle and most subsequent historians of philosophy, Thales was the first natural philosopher. He was the first thinker in the West to give what the Greeks called a logos of nature. The word nature in Greek is physis. So we might now say that Thales was the first physiologist. If you think of the word physiologist, that's what it simply means, is one who gives a logos of nature. And what is a logos? A logos is a rational explanation. The word logos, as in the word physiology, is present in many, many suffixes in many English words. A word like biology literally means a logos of life. The word psychology means a logos of the soul or the mind. Thales is called the first philosopher precisely because he is the first, again, this is according to Aristotle, he is the first to give a logos of nature. What sort of logos? What does this mean? Let me turn to the text itself and give you a little taste of it. I'm now quoting from Aristotle, who says the following: "Of those who first pursued philosophy, the majority believe that the only principles of all things are principles in the form of matter. For that out of which all existing things are composed, and that out of which they originally come into being, and that into which they finally perish, the substance persisting but changing in all its attributes, this, they state, is the principle of things that are. However, not all agree about the number and form of such a principle. But Thales, the founder of this kind of philosophy, declares it to be water." Now that's a mouthful. Let me try to unpack it a little bit. The first and the most important word to notice in this passage is the word that's translated in English as principle. Thales believed, along with other early Greek philosophers, that the principle of all things is material, is in the form of matter. What does the word principle mean? The Greek word here is wonderful and extremely important. The word is arche. Arche. This word can be translated as principle, as origin, as beginning, as source. It also can mean ruler. So perhaps what it means is the beginning which then rules over everything that follows. We have remnants of this word in our words archaic, archaeology, referring to very old things. The arche then is the beginning, not just in the sense of time, but the beginning in the sense of the fundamental origin of everything else. According to Aristotle, all of the early pre-Socratics believed that there was an arche and that the arche was in the form of matter. Specifically, with Thales, he believed that the arche was in the form of water. So now we can boil down Thales' position into one sentence. The arche is water.
So what's pretty cool about that whole thing right there is when you go back to John 1:1, and he just gave the two definitions, and ironically that's a professor of philosophy. He's not a professor of theology. He's not a professor of the Bible, not a professor of the New Testament. He's just talking about Greek philosophy and what the words arche and logos mean and what they meant to that what he was calling the first philosopher, right? So ironically, when he started talking about the principle, the beginning of all things, the arche is the principle, the beginning of all things that rules all things that came into being before. And his argument was that he believed that it was a physical thing, a physical matter of water. So what's interesting, John, this is like hundreds of years prior to this is hundreds of years prior to Jesus. So when John is writing in Greek to a Greek-speaking audience, and the Greek culture, and even the Jewish Hebrews at the time would have understood this philosophy. They would have known the worldviews of those around them. So when he says it, it's a very packed verse. Even if you understand what exactly the Greeks would have understood by the words arche and logos. So when John says, in arche in ho logos, ke ho logos in proston theon ke theos in ho logos. So in arche, when you just said that at the beginning, the principle of all things that came to be. So in the beginning is the logos, the word, right? The reason for everything. So the reason for everything, right? And so they're saying in the beginning was the reason for everything, or the word, right? And the word was with God, ke o logos in proston theon, ke theos in ho logos. And the word was God, right? So, outos in arche proston theon. He was, or this one is with God in the beginning. Right? If you go to verse 14, you get to see that logos, sarke, egeneto, became flesh. So it's obviously talking about Jesus, right? So Jesus became flesh. So in the beginning, the principle being before all things, even before time, even as the philosopher said, that the Greeks would have understood this as like the principle being of all things that ruled, right? So the Greeks understood this as matter, but the Christians are saying that no, prior to everything existing was God. It was Jesus and God. This is even prior to time, which is why they believe that Christ was God, which is why they believed in the Trinity. So like it's interesting that even in English, most Christians who even in today understand that as saying that Jesus is God, right? You have the minority of people interpreting it, usually from really poor translations, that try to include an indefinite article when there is no indefinite article in Kini Greek. So even in English, people understand that as saying that the word is Jesus, the word's with God, and the word is God, or was God, or whatever. Right, so he's with God in the beginning. So if you take this in Greek, though, and you understand who the audience he's talking to and unpack it, how they would have understood those terms and those meanings of those words, it's a lot deeper than the English. I mean, even in the English, even in the Greek, though, ke kores aftu egeneto udi in o gigonin. Let's see. And nothing through him came into being. That came into being, yeah. So and so even later on, it goes into like, and nothing came into being that has come into being, basically, except through him. So like, it gets even deeper in that in that verse that follows. So like, verse 3 actually confirms that understanding of arche as being the beginning prior to everything existing, and like the reason for everything existing, like Christ being the reason of all existence, that all things coming to being through him. Like there's no other denial, like there's no other way to get around that except for to just invalidate the Gospel of John entirely. You would have to literally reject the Gospel of John entirely to try to invalidate that. But then you have other verses like Philippians chapter 2 verse 5 through 7, Colossians 1:15 through 17, 1 Corinthians chapter 8 verse 6, where you can see the Apostle Paul including Jesus into the Shema prayer that the Jews used of Deuteronomy 6:4, and him including that into the prayer. So there's no way to get around Jesus being God, especially when you start understanding the language. Anyway, I thought that was pretty interesting as I was listening to that lecture, completely unrelated to theology. I was just listening to a philosophy professor teaching about the Greek philosophers and what they believed, just to gain an understanding of that time frame prior into. And I was really surprised when I started hearing him say that in a lecture about the arche and the logos. Anyway, that was pretty cool.